why is it that beliefs like I'm not enough, I'm unlovable, or I'll never be good enough can seem so difficult to change even when we know they aren't true? One of the things I've found quite interesting is that for many of us, simply knowing those beliefs aren't true doesn't necessarily stop them from influencing the way we understand ourselves, relate to other people, and experience the world around us. So, why are beliefs like these so hard to change? That's what I'd like us to spend a little time talking about today. We'll begin by looking at why understanding the experiences that shaped those beliefs matters. Then we'll talk about how those beliefs began developing, what happens when we begin understanding where they came from, why that understanding alone doesn't necessarily change them, and finally, why they can continue influencing the way we interpret new experiences. Hello, and welcome to Daring Woman. I am Dr. Latasha Pinckney, and through my work, I help people better understand the experiences, beliefs, and perspectives that shape how they see themselves, others, and the world around them. Whether you're trying to better understand your own life or you're someone who helps others make sense of theirs, well, welcome to the channel. Now let's get into it. Over the last 9 episodes, we've spent a lot of time looking back. We've spent a great deal of time discussing how our experiences contribute to the beliefs we develop about ourselves. We've also spent time looking at the ways those beliefs have shown up in our relationships, our expectations, and even the way we interpret our experiences. I imagine that for some people, they may be wondering, why have we spent so much time looking back in the first place? Is it even helpful or necessary to spend such valuable time looking at things that have already happened, especially when most of us have been taught that the healthiest thing we can do is to leave the past behind? Now, we've heard it all before. Just move on, get over it. There's no need to dwell on it. Or perhaps my favorite, what's done is done, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, while I certainly understand the reason for this advice, I've personally found that moving forward and understanding where we've been can coexist. And here's what I mean by that. When I think about why understanding our past matters, one of the observations I've made over the years is that we're often encouraged to study history because it helps us understand how we arrived at where we are in the world today. Yet when it comes to our own lives, we are sometimes discouraged from examining the very experiences that have shaped us. And honestly, I have always found that a little baffling because our personal history may be even more important. It helps us better understand not only how we arrived where we are now, but also how we come to see ourselves. Now, I certainly don't believe we're meant to dwell on the past by constantly replaying old conversations, reliving painful experiences, or remaining emotionally tethered to seasons that have already ended. But I do think there's a difference between remaining in the past and learning from it. Looking back isn't about trying to relive what happened. It's about better understanding how what happened may still be influencing us today. I was reminded of that not too long ago one day while I was out walking. Earlier that day, I'd had a conversation with someone that as I began replaying that conversation over in my mind, it left me feeling somewhat rejected. The more I thought about it, the more I found myself filling in the gaps of what hadn't actually been said. In other words, I was drawing conclusions that the conversation itself had never even communicated. And that's when I stopped and asked myself, what evidence do you have to actually support what you're currently believing? And the answer was none. It was in that moment that I recognized I wasn't simply responding to that particular conversation. I was also responding through a belief about myself that had developed years earlier. The example I just shared isn't one that's unique to me. If you've ever found yourself reacting more strongly than a situation seemed to warrant, or believing something about yourself that wasn't actually supported by what happened, you have probably experienced something similar. Now, something about me, I've always been introspective. Even as a young child, I was observing and trying to make sense of what was happening around me. I've said it before and I'll say it again, children notice far more than adults realize. And while the experiences I had as a child were absolutely real, because I was still a child with a limited understanding, the interpretations I developed about what those experiences meant eventually became beliefs about myself that weren't always true. And because I've spent much of my life trying to understand why I came to believe the things I believed about myself and about life overall, it has become my life's work to take what I've learned and share it with others in the hope that they too can begin making sense of their own lives. I say that because understanding helps us not only better understand ourselves, giving us a clearer picture of our struggles and the why behind many of the beliefs we've come to hold about ourselves, but it also changes the way we see others as we begin recognizing that their lives, just like our own, have also been shaped by certain experiences that influence how they show up today. I think part of the reason for this has to do with the way many of our beliefs about ourselves begin. They don't usually start as firmly established beliefs. More often than not, they begin developing while we were trying to make sense of our experiences. So, in order to better understand how many of our beliefs about ourselves began, we often have to go back to childhood. As my own experience shows, children are naturally trying to make sense of what they're experiencing. And sometimes in the process of trying to understand the things that are happening to them, they begin forming conclusions about what those experiences mean for them. And as life goes on, if we continue to have experiences that seem to reinforce those conclusions, they can gradually become the deeply held beliefs that shape how we see ourselves and what we come to believe is true about who we are. I've often thought of it this way. Just as a child grows physically by receiving the nourishment needed to develop into an adult, our beliefs about ourselves also develop through what sustains them. When life repeatedly seems to confirm what we've already come to believe about ourselves, those experiences become the nourishment that continues strengthening those beliefs. Now, I should probably pause here just for a moment and clarify something, because I don't want to give the impression that every belief we have about ourselves is untrue. Some of our beliefs are healthy and accurate, and they serve us well. The beliefs I'm referring to are the painful ones we sometimes come to believe about ourselves after we've endured difficult experiences. One of the things I've noticed in this never-ending process of self-examination as we seek to heal from painful experiences, continue growing, and become the fullest expression of who we were created to be is that simply understanding ourselves doesn't necessarily change the beliefs that have been shaping us. I recognize that may sound a little surprising because we often assume that once we understand the why behind how we think, feel, or respond the way we do, then change will naturally follow. But that's not always the case. For me, understanding where some of my beliefs came from helped me better understand my emotional triggers, some of the choices I made, and even some of the interests I pursued. But even with that understanding, there were plenty of times when those same beliefs were still operating in my life, even though I knew what they were and where they had come from. There were many instances when I would take almost anything personal, whether it was a perceived slight, a disappointment, or a misunderstanding, even though I understood those reactions had much deeper roots than the moment I was currently facing. Now, that's not to say that all of my responses were rooted in circumstances that happened long ago. There were absolutely times when people just behaved badly or situations were unfair. But there were other times when what I was feeling had less to do with what was happening in the moment and more to do with some painful beliefs about myself that had been operating in my life for years. But the fact remains that the beliefs that fueled many of these responses hadn't simply disappeared because I understood where they had come from. They were still actively influencing the way I interpreted the situations I found myself in. And that's because understanding the origin of a belief and changing the influence that belief has are not the same thing. But why is it often so difficult to change deeply held beliefs even after we understand where they came from? Researchers have found that deeply held beliefs often continue to influence the way we interpret new experiences, even when we're not consciously aware that it's happening. That's important because these beliefs are not always operating at a conscious level where we can easily recognize their influence. They become part of an internal network that holds memories of our experiences, the meanings we've attached to those experiences, and the expectations that developed from them. So when we experience something in the present, we aren't responding to that moment alone. We're also responding from everything that's been shaped by what came before it. And once a belief becomes firmly established, we're naturally more likely to interpret any new experiences in ways that are consistent with what we already believe about ourselves. Take, for example, someone who has come to believe they are unlovable. Normal situations in which a friend doesn't return a phone call, a spouse seems unusually quiet after work, or someone cancels on them at the last minute, none of those experiences automatically communicate that this person is being rejected. There may be actual legitimate explanations for why these things happened. But if a deeply held belief about being unlovable is already influencing how those experiences are being interpreted, it becomes much easier for a person to draw conclusions that seem consistent with what they have believed about themselves for years. Now, some researchers have described this as a self-perpetuating process because the beliefs we've already developed influence how we interpret new experiences, and those interpretations can seem to reinforce what we've already come to believe about ourselves. As that process continues, the belief often becomes more deeply rooted, making it even more likely that future experiences will be interpreted in ways that seem to reinforce it. So, what this tells us is that changing deeply held beliefs requires more than simply understanding the experiences that shaped them. And that's why many people become so frustrated with themselves. They may have spent the necessary time exploring the experiences that contributed to how certain beliefs about themselves developed, yet still find themselves responding in ways they thought they had already moved beyond. But if those beliefs have been influencing your life for years, then it becomes easier to understand why changing them requires more than simply knowing where they began. So as you reflect on today's conversation, maybe spend a little time considering whether there are beliefs in your life that continue to influence you in ways you've never fully considered before. Perhaps that's why Proverbs 4:7 encourages us in this way. In all you're getting, get understanding, because understanding helps us navigate this life with greater wisdom and clarity. Understanding may not undo the experiences that led to those beliefs, but it is often the first step toward changing them. Listen, that's all I have for now. Hopefully you got something out of today's episode, and if so, please be sure to share. And don't forget to check out the companion resource created to go along with it. You'll find the link in the episode description. Take care, and until next time, keep reflecting, keep growing, and remember that sometimes the most powerful shifts in perspective begin with a single question.